Today we are going to talk about a very important issue which each and every business student has to understand in order to be able to learn the true spirit of managerial economics, that is market forces and demand and supply. In the real life, prices of different goods and services change very frequently. Sometimes we are surprised to see these changes and we are not able to understand why these changes are taking place. This is what we are going to answer today. What is the reason behind all these things? If we normally go to the market, we will see that customers or consumers and producers, the buyers and sellers, they are interacting with each other. This is we are going to elaborate today in order to understand what goes on in the background of the market forces. The first concept to understand is the demand curve. According to law of demand, people demand something or people buy something more when price of that product or any service goes down. In other words, when price of a product or service goes up, people demand less of that quantity. Now this is in short called law of demand. It is law because it applies to each and every cases. Apart from some exceptions, that is not important for us to understand at the moment. Now this law of demand is saying that when price of any product, any good or service increases, people demand less of that product, that is good or services. Now we can show this law of demand in a graph. So we can look at the graph and we see that our demand curve, which is downward sloping, which shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. And obviously because the demand curve is downward sloping, it means that it is moving from up to down. If you look at the curve from the left, then we see that it is going downward, and it is because of the fact that the relationship between price and quantity is negative or opposite, in other words. For example, when price of any product, say product X, good X, is 10 taka, people demand 4 units of that product. On the other hand, if price falls or goes down from 10 to 6 taka now, people will demand or consumers will demand more than before, which is 7 units now. So this curve is basically showing that consumers are demanding different amount of the same product, good or service, at different prices. So for each and every product, for each and every price, there is a separate quantity. So all these combinations of quantity and prices can be shown in this demand curve, which is downward sloping. Now there are some qualifications behind this curve. It is downward sloping, but we have assumed that there are some other factors which in reality affect this demand curve are held constant. In other words, we get this downward sloping demand curve with this provision or with this condition that the other factors which really affect this demand curve are held constant. So if we let these other factors move or change, then what will happen? This demand curve itself will shift. So what are those factors which affect our demand curve? They are normally called, in the language of economics, determinants of demand or factors of demand. They can also be called demand shifters. What I mean to say here is that, for example, we can explain it with the help of an example. For example, take the case of income of people, income of consumers, or average income of consumers. If income of consumers increases from a certain level to another level, what happens? Even if the price does not fall or price does not change, people will demand more of the same product because of the increase in income now. As an example, we can look at the road, what is going on. People are buying more cars, although price of cars is increasing. So this is a puzzle which can be explained by this fact that income is affecting our demand curve. In other words, although the price of car is increasing, at the same time people's income, average income I mean, is also increasing. So in terms of graph, we can see that this increase in income is expressed or shown by the shift in the demand curve, or in other words a new demand curve, which is D1. So we see that our demand curve, which was initially D0 or D0, has moved from D0 to D1, and this new demand curve is showing that people's income or consumers' income has increased. So when the price is 6 taka per unit of any product, then if the income did not change, so assuming that income was at the previous level, then people would demand 7 units of this product. Because income has increased, the new demand curve is D1. At this new demand curve, at the same price, which is 6 taka, people are demanding, or consumers are demanding, more products than before, which is 13 now. So it means that the demand curve has itself shifted. At this point, it is very important to understand the difference between movement along the demand curve and the shift in the demand curve. Movement along the demand curve means when consumers demand different quantities at different prices. So we are basically on the same demand curve. Now the movement is taking place only because of the changes in price. If price goes up, we will demand less of the same product, and if price goes down, we will demand more. So we are basically remaining on the same demand curve. On the other hand, by the word shift in the demand curve, we mean that something apart from the price is affecting our demand curve. For example, we have just mentioned income. If income increases, then what happens? The demand curve itself shifts outward. So we get a new demand curve, and according to this new demand curve, even if the price does not change, we demand more of the same product. So this is the shift in the demand curve. So shift in the demand curve is taking place because of the changes in any of the factors that affect our demand curve. Apart from this income, we have many other things which are demand shifters, or which are determinants of demand. They are prices of related good. Apart from income we have already mentioned. So prices of related good. Two goods can be substitutes of each other. For example, Lux and Care. Now these two soaps are substitute of each other. So whatever the price of Lux is charging the consumer is going to affect how many Care soaps will be demanded by the people. Similarly, two products can be complements of each other. For example, tea and sugar. So if the price of tea increases, that is going to affect the demand for sugar as well, because when price of tea increases, people will demand less tea. As a result, people will demand less sugar as well, because tea and sugar, these two things are consumed together. As an example, another example of these complements, we can cite petrol and car. So these two things are consumed together. So if price of petrol increases, what we see that because petrol prices have increased, gone up, people will demand less car than before. It is because of the changes in the price of petrol. Now, apart from these two, we have a few more. Then comes advertising. If a company, a business organization, massively advertises a product, that is going to affect the consumer. The consumers will be inclined to buy some product because of the advertisement more than before, even if the price has not changed. And then population. If number of people who are using that product increases, so regardless of the whatever the price is, people will demand the same product more than before. What we have explained just now is one of the two market forces, that is demand. Now we are going to talk about another market force, which is supply, which is going to represent what producers are thinking behind their mind or in their mind. According to law of demand, we saw that when price of any product increases, then consumers buy less of that product. But in case of law of supply, we see completely a different picture. According to law of supply, producers are happy when price of any product increases. In other words, they want to, or they are willing to supply more than before when price of any product increases. And the opposite is also true. In other words, when price of any product, any good or service decreases, they are willing now to supply less than before. This is called law of supply. According to this law of supply, we can draw a supply curve now, which is again going to express the relationship between two variables. One is price, another one is supply, quantity. Now here it is quantity supplied rather than quantity demanded. Now these two relationships are basically positive or moving to the same direction. So we see that supply curve is upward sloping. So this upward sloping curve is showing the positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Now you see that in the supply curve, when price of any good is, say good X is 10 taka per unit, now suppliers are willing to supply 5 units of that product. When price increases from 10 to 20 taka, then suppliers are now willing to supply more, from 5 units to 10 units. So this is again because of the law of supply, which is saying that suppliers are willing to supply more when the price of any good or service goes up. Now as we discussed in the shift, in case of shift of demand curve, we have also some shifters of supply curve, which are called in the language of economics determinants of supply, which are factors which cause any shift in the supply curve, which is different from movement in the supply curve. In case of movement in the supply curve, we see that it is the price which is causing the movement along the supply curve. In other words, when price of any product increases, suppliers are willing to supply more, and when price of the same product decreases, suppliers are willing to supply less. This is movement along the supply curve. On the other hand, shift in the supply curve is something when any of the factors of supply or determinants of supply changes in the market. One of these factors is, say, government regulation. Now if the government puts some taxes on an industry, then what will happen? Suppliers will find it a discouragement towards their production. So they will be less willing to produce than before. So they will be producing less than before, and their supply curve will shift leftward or go inside. So if we look at the diagram, we see that the new supply curve has moved leftward from S0 to S1. So previously the price of that product was 6 and suppliers were willing to supply 5 units of that product. Now because of this shift in the supply curve, they are willing to supply less, which is expressed in this new supply curve. Now that we have learned what is demand curve, what is supply curve, what is movement along the demand curve, what is movement along the supply curve, what are the shifters of demand curve, or what is the shift in the demand curve, and then we have learned what are the shifters of supply curve and what is the shift in the supply curve. Now if we bring this supply and demand curves together, basically we form a market. So what is market? Market is nothing but the interaction between demand and the supply curve. So a market is not basically a marketplace, or it is not a physical something like a building or a mall, a shopping plaza. No, basically market can be formed anywhere. It can be over the telephone, can be on the internet, can be anywhere else. Even without saying any specific word, a market can be formed with the help of interaction between demand and supply. Now when we have these two curves together, we have a market. On the again vertical axis we have price, and the now horizontal axis we have quantity. Now this quantity is for both demand and supply, and we see that our demand and supply curve are crossing each other and they intersect each other at a specific point. This point is called equilibrium point. If we look at the diagram, we see that equilibrium point is occurring somewhere where the price is 7 unit, and at this point both the demanders and the suppliers are willing to demand and supply the same amount of good. In other words, at this price, which is 7, whatever demanders are willing to buy is exactly the same as whatever the suppliers are willing to sell. So here at this point there is no tendency among the suppliers and as well as consumers to change the situation, and it will be as this position unless and until any of the determinants of demand and supply affect our market. If for any reason any consumer wants to pay less or any supplier wants to charge higher, then this market equilibrium will not be at its place. There will be shortage in the market or there will be surplus in the market. If we look at the next diagram, we see that if demanders are willing to pay 5 taka, then if the price is 5 taka, then what happens that suppliers think that this price is too low, so they are going to supply only 6 units. But in the eye of demanders, this price is quite attractive, and that's why they are going to demand 12 units. Now the difference between 6 and 12 units is very large and very high, and which is named as shortage. Whenever there is a shortage in the market, what happens? Consumers put a pressure in the market on the price. So price is going to be high now. So the price is now going to move along this demand and supply curve up until it reaches again the equilibrium price, which is 7. On the other hand, if price is too high, in other words, if say suppliers ask for 9 taka for each and every unit, then what will happen? Consumers will think that this price is very high. So at this price they will demand only 6 units of that product. On the other hand, in the eye of suppliers, this is a good news, they are going to supply much of this product. Now they will supply 14 units. Now the difference between 6 and 14 is 8 units, which is surplus. It means that suppliers are left with excess goods or service. So they will be now willing to attract customers, so that attract consumers, so that consumers buy rest of their products or goods. In order to attract customers or consumers, they have to lower the price. Again the price will come down to the 7, which is equilibrium price. So we can end this lecture by saying that the market forces are very important for us to understand, and these market forces explain why price of any product is at something say 6 or taka or 7 taka, whatever it is, and why a certain quantity is sold and bought in the market. Thank you very much. I hope that you have understood this lecture and quite understood what are the market forces and the demand and supply. Thank you.